Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with Mehul and Jaria. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the criminal justice system as a whole and where some of the failings and biases might be.
When you work with defendants in criminal matters, you can sometimes get an unfortunate fatigue. You hear, I'm innocent, you hear the system's rigged, and you can kind of just, it becomes white noise. But, you know, as we hear more of people being exonerated by DNA and some of the scandals in the jails, we realize that some of these things are true and, you know, we need to pay attention to them.
You know, you've told me many stories about inmates who have used some choice words for the system. What are some of the terms they've used?
Oh, okay, I've got some classics, and most of these come from pro pers. I had one, he was a biker pro per, and he talked about the system as a conviction syndicate. And I love this term. Whether or not I agree with it is a different story. But basically he's saying, hey, look, the deck is stacked against him. You know, the judge is working with the DA is working with the defense attorney, and all the defendants are just widgets. And they're just trying to push him through the system as quickly as possible. And they're all in league as if they're like the mafia or something like that. So they're in his mind, they're a conviction syndicate.
So just pushing it through.
All in league. It's all about numbers. It's about cranking out widgets.
So for DNA cases, what are the resources available? What's at the disposal of the defense?
Well, I'm going to give you a few more. I got a few more of these words that the pro pers use. So I was talking to a guy the other day, and he was with a public defender, didn't like him, don't know the reasons exactly, don't know if they were legitimate. But he referred to him as the public pretender. So again, the idea that maybe they just, you just throw a guy an attorney just for show, but maybe the attorney's not really doing anything. So I had a good laugh out of that, the public pretender. Another pro per I was talking to was just talking about some of the irony about, you know, a lot of cases, if there's somebody who even looks like a gang member, they're going to attack on a gang enhancement to whatever the charges are. And that is a very serious enhancement in terms of prison time. And obviously any intimation of gang activity could be prejudicial towards a jury.
So this is just kind of like almost like a knee jerk for the prosecution. Just whatever they did, add gang to it, you know?
Sometimes it really seems that way. It seems
DUI, gang to it.
Right. You know? Yeah, it seems like the strategy is put down as many charges as possible so that if you get 1/3 of them, then you still have a victory and you got the prison time you needed.
That's actually what I hear that a lot is just overcharging. And then, you know, you plead down, you get the conviction because they don't want to look at 130 years, so they just overcharge them.
Right. And so not to digress too much, but, you know, you'll ask me sometimes, well, did you get a win in that case? Did you get a win? Well, a win is not always a complete exoneration or the guy goes home. Sometimes a win is, hey, we knocked off 3 charges that took 20 years off this guy's sentence. And to the outsider, maybe that doesn't seem like a huge win, but that's somebody's life. And if they're charged appropriately of what they actually did and serve the time that they deserve, then that is a win.
You know, I don't want to be redundant, but I think you need to state that again and how, because that's actually a really big deal, is it right? So defining a win is not always walking out of jail.
Exactly. Are you doing the time for the exact crime you committed, or are you doing extra time just because you're a bad person?
That's got to be a fine line these days.
Right. So that's some of the minutiae I deal with. So, you know, if somebody was charged for 10 different things and looking at, 30 or, consecutive life prison sentences, if the DNA knocks out a few of them and it's more appropriate to what was actually done, that's a win, even if the guy's not going home.
This is really fascinating for me, and hopefully for people listening. This is a real inside the justice system look from a player. And by player, because you're seeing this from all sides. You've seen it from the prosecution side, working for a police department, and now from the side of the fence. You're seeing what happens right before your eyes when you walk into Men's Central Jail, how you're treated, what the pro pers are telling you. So this is a real kind of inside baseball of the justice system. It's kind of a fun treat for the average person to say, hey, look, this is what you see on TV. This is what you see on the news, on crime shows. But let me set you straight. This is what it really looks like. And this is what I go through and what you can expect if you get into the justice system.
Right, exactly. I'll give you another ironic example. I was talking to a inmate the other day. He's got some gang association, but in this instant case, the question is a gang enhancement really appropriate? And he was talking about how he's had a few cases in the system, but he was talking about back in around 2011 at Men's Central Jail, there was a group of deputies who essentially saw themselves as a gang. They were called the 3000 Boys. They were in charge of the 3000 level at Men's Central Jail, which is where the most serious inmates are kept. And they had tattoos and all this kind of stuff. And you hear this inmate saying, well, gee, isn't it ironic that I'm sort of being investigated by somebody who's essentially a gang member themselves, even though they have a badge on?
Obviously that person put themselves there, but what about just an average person who just gets caught up in the system for the first time and you find yourself there? I mean, that's got to be extremely.
You don't know the game. You don't know how to. It's almost like you hear, or maybe in Hollywood, about how do you cope in prison, and you got to do all these weird things. But in a way, if you're in the justice system whatsoever, it's the same thing. You've got to play the game to some extent.
Oh man, that's a scary thought. Okay, so for DNA cases, what resources are available to the defense?
Well, the defense side, they have to rely on independent experts and DNA laboratories. So, there are law enforcement crime labs. Some of them are run by district attorneys. But for the defense, there's no defense DNA laboratory. So there's not a real specific structure that they can use, and they have to use independent people. So for me, I now work 100% with the defense. It's not because I won't work with the prosecution. It's because they have their own experts and they have that infrastructure that the defense does not.
Just to stay on that note, what is it? When you go up against, a high-priced, no, I can say they're high-priced, but a top-level prosecution, and they see you walk in on a pro per or just on the side of a normal defense where you're retained, what's their response to you?
Sometimes it's like, wow, I didn't think you were going to bring an expert in. And so you get sort of the idea that,
like, you mean by they thought it was going to be a cakewalk?
Exactly. So now all of a sudden we're kind of getting in their business a little bit. We're saying, we're not going to, you gave me 3 pieces of paper that talk about DNA, but I know that doesn't tell the whole story. So we're going to push it to the next level. And I think sometimes in some of the lower cases I've had, I know the DA is kind of like, wow, you're making an issue of that? Or maybe we're going to test something where people think, it's not classically a DNA case, but let's find out if that person's DNA was on the weapon. And I think that will help sometimes if there is a plea in the bargaining. Like, you know what? We're going to sniff out every little detail here. You might have thought this was a tiny case.
So that could actually change the way that they're going to prosecute the case then.
I think so.
Once they see that you're, attached or retained to the defense.
Sure, because just in case for strategy, if they know a part of their case is weak, maybe they'll just float it anyway.
Right.
But now if somebody's really going to ask for all the discovery, do testing, and bring in an expert, it may not be worth them fighting that battle.
I can imagine you've had some pretty interesting conversations or run-ins with the, in the hallways before and after cases with the prosecution.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
anything, I don't want to get too off topic, but is there anything you want to share? No names, of course.
Yeah.
Any F-bombs or...
Oh, yeah, you name it. There was one big trial I was involved in, and during the trial, we actually had an admissibility hearing. The defense wanted to bring this DNA in, and the prosecution didn't. And we won. And the attorney all of a sudden got very bitter and was really just crying to the judge. And whereas he was pretty cordial to me earlier, now in the break in the hall, he was going in on me. And he said, I'd like to talk to you. He goes, you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to. And I told him flat out to his face, I said, I know what you're saying, but if I don't, you're going to tell the jury tomorrow when I testify that this guy didn't talk. So like, dude, I know you're playing me. So we get out in the hall. I'm like, hey, I'm happy to play with you. I'm happy to talk with you. I'd like to be the same to all sides. And he just was going at me. And I just told him, I said, do you want to talk about the case? You want to talk about facts? Or do you want to just, be crazy out here?
So
and the attorney I was working with was like, you don't have to talk to him if you don't want to. You don't have to talk to him. I'm like, I'll talk to him, but speak reasonably to me.
Right.
And I think, though, sometimes that experts get intimidated. Most people work in a lab. That's not
so you
their
think
world.
that was his play? Was just to
Yes. He's like, I'm going to intimidate this guy.
And just say, hey, look, this is what you can expect from me once you get on the stand.
Exactly. And I don't think I mentioned this, but in this hearing, there was a question of a strangulation, and he wanted to do a demonstration on me, essentially put me in a headlock. And I was like, okay, I was willing to do that. And you could tell he did it a little bit hard. And I think he was really trying to send me a message and intimidate me. And in fact, the next day when I testified at trial, he didn't do that in front of the jury because he knew that wouldn't play well.
He was doing a little test run to see what your response was.
Yeah, I think so.
The games,
I think so.
The behind-the-scene games.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we know money is always an issue. There is a show on Reels called Rich and Acquitted, and I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so, much to the delight of my friends and family, I always pontificate on this. And, the idea is the O.J. Simpsons and the Michael Jacksons, they bought their freedom, And I just don't see it that way. I see an imbalance in the system, and this is why I now work with the defense. Most cases, the defendant has no money whatsoever. They're indigent. They're given a public defender. But what's on the other side of the equation? What is the resources of the DA's office? It's huge. They've got, a couple thousand people working there if they're a big office. They've got in-house investigators, in-house clerical staff, law students, you name it. So if somebody comes in who has money, who can thoroughly investigate a case on the defense side, get a DNA expert, get an investigator, get an attorney who will file all sorts of motions and appear in court as much as possible, are you really buying justice, or are you just leveling the playing field? I say you're leveling the playing field.
Yeah, that's actually what I take away from what you just said, is that's all you're doing, is just getting it to where you at least have an opportunity for a victory. And so, go ahead.
Yeah, I just as an example, I remember being involved in a civil matter one time where there was really tens of millions of dollars at stake. And, the defense attorneys were the top people. And there was international investigations involved and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, and guess what? The defense won. But if that person didn't have money and couldn't investigate that thoroughly, might have been a different answer.
So the issue is, once you're in the system, you're in trouble. And so it's just best just to stay out altogether.
Yeah, exactly. And just, one more anecdote. There's always this, what I call a fallacy, that if a defense expert testifies in court, the first question is, what are you being paid to be there? As if that you're just a hired gun. Some people are. Absolutely. It happens. But whatever, if I review DNA and serve as a consultant and testify, whatever money I'm making pales in comparison to the resources that the prosecution has expended to test DNA, to employ the people at the crime lab, to keep the lights on, to buy the testing, all of this stuff. You almost have to have a business mind to really understand what is the true cost of putting on a DNA case on the prosecution side.
And it's always ironic how they always point that on the defense side. Oh, you're just a hired gun, when they're not mentioning the, like you just listed, the thousands of people on their side that they're spending money on with an unlimited budget.
Yeah, and this idea of bias, which now I think it's becoming a little bit more accepted that the bias could be on the other side as well. So in terms of forensic science, there's a big push to why are all these labs under the purview of law enforcement? That is a problem with bias, potentially. Shouldn't it just be a neutral body? You take it to the lab, you get what you get. There's not really an advocate per se on either side. And I'll give you a story. This is old, and again, friends and family have heard it a million times. But I remember when the private lab that I co-founded, we had just gotten accredited, and we were the first DNA lab in California to get this higher level accreditation. And I went to a conference, and there was somebody talking about the CODIS database, and they said, well, we don't want private labs involved in this because they have commercial bias. And I'm thinking, number one, I've got a higher level accreditation than your lab does. Number two, what about the law enforcement bias? You can't tell me there's at least potential bias there. Just unbelievably offensive.
Why isn't that independent? Why is it set up that way? Because it just seems like it's
always been done that way. And now sort of the blowback is, well, it's too expensive or complicated to change it. But I think as the years go on, we're going to see more of a migration towards taking it out of the hands of law enforcement. And, there's been some actual formal suggestions over the last couple of years that be done. So the rebuttal is it's too costly, and that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah, but look at the downside. Look at how many cases in labs we've talked about across the United States that the criminologist doing the DNA testing for the lab is cross-contaminated cases, and thousands of cases have been thrown out. Now, do you think that would happen if it was at an independent lab?
Well, mistakes are universal. Mistakes are going to happen anywhere, but
but what if you get an actual biased person working at that lab that's like, kind of everybody's guilty until proven innocent type attitude, where they're, kind of like, say, tipping the scales for the prosecution?
Well, that's a huge problem. And there have been lab scandals where people are doing just that, doing things like dry labbing. In other words, they don't do the analysis. They just give the report and say, well, hey, it's incriminating. But, some of the bias is subtle and it's only potential. So it could be that if you're looking at evidence that's a little bit one way or the other, you almost unconsciously could have some sort of bias. So I think the idea is, let's just take that out of the equation. Yeah. If you have a neutral entity, you could have a bad apple. You could have a bad apple in a neutral entity too, but let's just take that out of the equation.
It just seems more sense. So there's no, what they say, a dog in the fight type thing.
It's science. It's not police. It's not police science. It's science.
John Grissom recently wrote an op-ed in the LA Times about 8 reasons for America's shameful number of wrongful convictions. Obviously, DNA has been huge in exposing these. Give us some more insight on this.
This is great that we've exposed the wrongful convictions in DNA. Innocence Project has done maybe almost 400. And that's great for cases that have DNA evidence. But of all the people sitting in jail who may be wrongly convicted, what percentage of them have we caught through DNA? It's probably extremely low. I don't know what the numbers are, but I know that it's scary. So what if there is no DNA evidence? What do we do then? And even if there is DNA evidence in a case and you want to pursue post-conviction DNA testing, this is not an easy process. There's more money for it now, but it's limited funding. You're dealing with the egos of people on some occasions. I mean, think about it. If you're a prosecutor or a judge who sent someone to jail or death row and it was a wrongful conviction, that's hard to live with. And you may not want people poking around in that and showing you the other way. There has to be DNA evidence available. Like maybe it was collected, but if the case is 30, 40 years old, did they throw it out? Can it be found? Was it handled properly? Before we knew about DNA, we weren't as cautious. So is any of the evidence, would testing it mean anything if it's been contaminated? And, you have to show very good cause for post-conviction DNA testing. You have to show that identity was an issue. You have to show that there's some sort of technology now that did not exist back then. And you have to show how DNA is really going to make a difference in the case, assuming that you've always maintained your innocence.
It seems like there's been more and more of these in the media, and the states are actually, to their credit, starting to create some budgets, so they can actually go back and look where those elements that you just mentioned are available. Like they because right now everybody in prison is innocent.
Right.
So, but if you can actually come and you have, like, let's say the Innocence Project behind you, and you've got some real compelling evidence, there actually seems to be some money available for that now.
Well, and it's twofold. It's grant money for post-conviction cases, and to their credit, a lot of the prosecutors are starting their own conviction integrity units. So they're taking it upon themselves to say, you know what? Hey, forensic science is different than it was 20 years ago. Standards are different. Let's go back on our own. Let's not get caught with our pants down by somebody else. Let's own up to it, and let's go look at these cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. What would be better, having someone point out that you made the mistake, or finding the mistake yourself and bringing it forward?
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.